The wind screamed like an animal caught between worlds, half pain, half fury, as it battered the frosted windows of Rosie's diner. Outside, the Montana plains had vanished beneath a sea of white. Snow fell in thick, relentless veils, covering every road sign, every tree, every path back to the world Grace Turner used to know. She stood behind the counter, hands wrapped around a mug of her own cooling coffee, eyes fixed on nothing and everything all at once. The diner creaked under the weight of the storm, but it held, like her. Grace had spent 3 nights alone in that diner, with the hum of the failing generator and the whistle of wind for company. The phone had gone dead on the first day. The deliveries never came. She rationed the propane, counted the cans in the pantry twice a day, and checked the back freezer like it might change since the last time she looked. It never did. There were no customers now. Not since the storm rolled in like a judgment, unannounced and merciless. But Grace kept coming downstairs every morning, turned on the lights, when they worked, wiped the counters, and brewed the coffee like Tom was still watching. His photo sat at the edge of the cash register, smiling in faded uniform, his army name tag just visible. Tom Turner. Husband. Builder. Protector. Gone 2 years now, but still the reason she stayed. The town had grown quieter since he passed. People moved on. The highway didn't bring in the same traffic it used to. Most days, Rosie's Diner, named after her mother, was more memory than business. But Grace wasn't ready to let go. Not of the smell of bacon grease in the morning, not of the stool Tom always took by the window, not of the idea that someone, anyone, might need this place someday. The first night of the blizzard, she thought it would pass by morning. The second, she realized she might be the only person left awake for miles. By the third, she stopped expecting anything. And yet she stayed. She swept the floor even as snow buried the front steps. She heated chili and poured it into thermoses even though there was no one to drink it. She kept the radio on low in the kitchen, catching only static and the occasional military broadcast breaking through the white noise. Something about convoys rerouting. Something about units going dark. And still, Grace didn't lock the door. She didn't know what exactly she was waiting for. Maybe it was someone lost in the white, needing warmth. Maybe it was Tom, walking through that door again, like the war never took him. Maybe it was just the hope that kindness wasn't something the storm could take from her. The snow climbed higher. The cold crept in even as she stuffed towels under the doorframe and stoked the little fire in the hearth Tom had built with his hands. Her hands ached. Her breath was visible in the hallway. But the sign outside still read, "Open." And the coffee was still hot. The door didn't creak. It exploded. Grace had just refilled the pot of chili, steam rising into the cold air like a fragile promise, when the diner door slammed open with a gust so sharp it knocked a napkin dispenser to the floor. Her body tensed, heart caught somewhere between fear and instinct. But what entered wasn't wind or warning. It was 12 men, soldiers, bundled in layers of soaked uniforms, faces red with cold, some barely able to walk upright. They looked like they'd come from another world, one made entirely of ice and silence. The lead one, a young man with frost clinging to his eyelashes, stepped forward and reached for his pocket. His hands trembled. "Ma'am, we can pay. We just need." "Sit down," Grace said, her voice calm, firm, echoing from someplace deeper than her body. She nodded toward the booths. "You're home now. Breakfast is on me." There was no argument. The men collapsed into seats like falling timber, grateful, wordless, too cold to register much beyond the miracle of warmth. Grace moved as if in muscle memory. She poured coffee, handed out mugs like ammunition against the storm, set bowls of chili in front of each man without asking names. Their eyes followed her like they couldn't believe she was real. She noticed the youngest one, barely 20, clutching a photo inside his glove. A child's face. A woman smiling. The soldier kept blinking, as if unsure if he was still alive. Another sat with his hands cupped around the mug, unmoving, as if afraid it might disappear. None of them spoke at first. The silence was not awkward. It was sacred. Grace didn't ask what unit they were from. didn't press for their route. She didn't need to know what brought them here, only that they had come. Her husband had taught her that. Sometimes, he used to say, you don't need answers. You just need a place to land. She set out bacon, then biscuits, then pancakes, everything she had left. When one soldier stood, fumbling with a wallet, she placed her hand on his. It was cracked and bleeding from the cold. You already paid when you signed up, she whispered. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, something quieter took hold. Something warmer. It wasn't just the food or the heat. It was the return of something these men had lost out there in the snow: dignity, safety, the feeling of being seen not as uniforms but as human beings. One of them, Sergeant Danny Brooks, she'd learn later, watched her closely, his eyes narrow not in suspicion but in disbelief. Finally, his voice broke the silence. Aren't you worried about supplies? He asked hesitantly. What if you run out? Grace refilled his coffee. Of course I'm worried, she replied. But Tom always said if you've got more than someone else in a storm, you share it. No one freezes on our watch. That was the moment it changed. The moment she saw it in their faces. Not just relief, but reverence. As if this roadside diner was no longer just shelter. As if Grace Turner, widow, keeper of a nearly forgotten flame, had become something else entirely in their eyes. A reminder of why they served. A reason to keep going. And so the soldiers stayed. They pulled their jackets tighter. They ate in silence. And slowly, as the minutes passed, something thawed that had nothing to do with the temperature. A few offered soft thank yous. One even smiled. A soldier with a deep scar down his cheek asked if he could help with the dishes. Grace just waved him off and said, Rest. You've already done more than enough. They didn't know that this place, this tiny diner buried in snow, had been kept alive not by customers, but by love. Not by profit, but by purpose. They didn't know that for 3 nights, Grace had sat in that empty room and waited, without knowing what for. Now she did. By nightfall, the diner no longer felt like just a diner. The storm outside screamed louder than ever, slamming snow against the windows in violent gusts that made the glass tremble in its frame. But inside, there was warmth, not just from the flickering fire Grace kept stoked in the brick hearth, but from the quiet, undeniable shift in energy. The soldiers had gone from guests to something closer to family. And Grace, moving among them with a coffee pot in one hand and a threadbare quilt over her shoulder, had become their anchor. The lights flickered again and she felt it, deep in her bones, that the generator wouldn't last. She didn't say it aloud. No one needed more reason to worry. But when the hum of electricity died completely just after midnight and the diner slipped into sudden darkness, there was no panic. No shouts, no movement. Just the sound of wind and the subtle way people hold their breath when something larger than themselves moves through the room. Grace lit an oil lamp she kept beneath the counter. It had belonged to her mother, and before that, to her grandmother, who ran a kitchen not so different from this one. Its soft glow didn't fill the room, but it calmed it. She placed it on the center table, casting warm light on tired faces, red eyes, trembling hands. Looks like we're roughing it tonight, boys, she said softly, almost playfully, as she handed out flashlights and laid blankets down like a mother putting her children to bed. One soldier chuckled, and another let out a low, grateful sigh. Someone found a deck of cards in a drawer. The edges were curled. 2 cards were missing, but no one cared. They played anyway, passing time like prisoners waiting for dawn. Grace moved through it all without hurry. She paused by each table, topping off mugs with what remained of the coffee, brushing snow from damp shoulders, pressing warm biscuits into cold hands. Her body was tired, but her presence didn't falter. They needed her not just for warmth, but for something else, something unspoken. Danny Brooks sat by the window again, his gaze fixed on the snow piling high outside, but his mind clearly elsewhere. When she refilled his cup, he caught her wrist gently. Grace, he said, voice hoarse, you saved us. She shook her head, setting the pot down.
No, son.
You save us every day. This was just breakfast. He didn't respond, not right away. He stared into the mug, the weight of his own history pressing down like the snow outside. Grace understood it without asking. The things these boys carried weren't just rifles and packs. It was grief, guilt, loneliness, ghosts they couldn't name. She returned to the counter and stood for a moment, her hand resting on the photograph of Tom in his army uniform. "They found their way here, honey," she whispered. "Just like you said they would." In the silence of that powerless night, the diner transformed. It became more than walls and warmth. It became sanctuary. A chapel of coffee and quilts and quiet acts of care. The kind of place where men who'd learned to sleep with one eye open could, for once, let both close. Outside, the storm showed no sign of mercy. But within Rosie's diner, a fragile peace had taken root, fueled not by fire or food alone, but by the steadiness of a woman who chose, again and again, to stay. The morning broke under a gray sky, the storm's fury finally easing into a dull, relentless drizzle. Grace moved quietly among the sleeping soldiers, their bodies curled beneath blankets and quilts, faces softened in vulnerable rest. The diner was still dim, lit only by the wan light slipping through frost-lined windows and the lingering glow of the oil lamp that had kept the darkness at bay overnight. She tended to the small gas stove, boiling water for tea, humming softly a tune Tom used to whistle in the quiet moments before dawn. Suddenly, the sound of distant engines rumbled faintly against the muted storm. Grace paused, heart quickening. Outside, the snow had piled high, nearly swallowing the convoy's vehicles that had struggled through the blizzard the day before. But now, a new line of military trucks appeared through the swirling mist, their headlights cutting through the cold gray. The soldiers, sensing the change, began to stir with cautious hope. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Jensen emerged from the convoy, his figure tall and steady despite the exhaustion etched in his face. His uniform bore the white dusting of snow, but his eyes held a clear purpose. Grace met his gaze, a silent understanding passing between them. She had kept them alive. Now, they were here to support her. The arrival transformed the diner and its fragile sanctuary into a lifeline. Crates of supplies, fresh food, blankets, coal for the hearth, even portable heaters, were unloaded with methodical precision, hands working in tandem despite fatigue. Soldiers and civilians alike moved side by side, creating order out of chaos. Grace watched, her heart swelling with relief and something close to pride. She was no longer alone in this fight against the storm. The army's presence brought warmth not only through new fuel and provisions, but through the simple reassurance that help had arrived. Lieutenant Colonel Jensen approached her again, this time with a clipboard and a formal invitation, his tone respectful yet urgent. "We want to keep your generator running, ma'am. We'll share everything we have. Your diner is more than a place to eat, it's a beacon. Let us help you keep it alive." Grace hesitated, the weight of responsibility pressing down, but Tom's words echoed in her mind. "If you've got more than someone else in a storm, you share it." With a quiet nod, she accepted. Together, they kindled a new fire in the diner's hearth, a fire fueled not just by coal, but by solidarity, resilience, and a shared determination to weather the storm. The soldiers moved from guests to partners, their laughter mingling with the crackle of flames and the clatter of kitchen utensils. The diner, once isolated and vulnerable, now thrummed with life and hope, a steadfast refuge carved from ice and snow. Outside, the blizzard might still rage, but inside, a new chapter had begun, one where kindness met strength and survival was a collective act. Grace Turner's small roadside diner had become a fortress of humanity, standing strong against the storm. As the hours slipped by, the roadside diner transformed into something far beyond its humble origins. What had begun as a simple shelter from the storm now stood as a fortified outpost amid the relentless, white wilderness. The hum of generators replaced the quiet flicker of oil lamps. Portable heaters banished the lingering chill, filling the cramped space with a warmth that seeped into every corner and crevice. Grace moved through this evolving sanctuary with a quiet determination, her presence both steady and reassuring to the soldiers who now called this place home, if only temporarily. Outside, snow continued to drift down in soft, endless waves, layering the landscape in a thick, suffocating blanket. But inside, the atmosphere buzzed with life and purpose. Soldiers in frost-speckled uniforms moved with practiced efficiency, unloading crates of supplies with care and urgency. Fresh bread, canned goods, stacks of firewood, and insulated jackets were stacked meticulously along the walls, their mere presence a promise of survival. The scent of hot chili simmering on the stove mingled with the sharp, earthy smell of coffee brewing strong, small comforts in a vast sea of hardship. Grace found herself teaching Sergeant Emily Perez how to flip pancakes on the flat-top grill, laughter spilling from the kitchen despite the exhaustion in their bones. The soldiers gathered around mismatched tables, sharing stories, playing cards, and offering quiet encouragement to one another. This unlikely community had sprung up from shared adversity, forged in the crucible of storm and service. In a quiet corner, Sergeant Danny Brooks dealt cards to a group of young privates, his weathered hands steady despite the faint tremor of fatigue. Their laughter was a fragile thread of normalcy woven through the hardship, a reminder that even in the darkest moments, the human spirit sought connection and hope. Grace's gaze often drifted to the old brick hearth, the centerpiece Tom had built with his own hands, now roaring with fresh coal and firelight. It was more than just warmth. It was a symbol, a heartbeat of the diner's soul. Every crackle echoed the legacy of sacrifice and resilience that had brought them all here. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Jensen returned frequently, his respect for Grace growing with each visit. He brought news and updates, shared plans for the convoy's movement, and sought her counsel on how best to maintain the delicate balance between survival and service. The diner had become their command post, a place where orders were exchanged over shared meals and quiet moments of reflection. Though the storm still raged beyond the walls, inside this makeshift outpost, a new kind of battle was being fought, a battle of endurance, unity, and hope. Grace Turner, once just a woman holding on to memories and a legacy, had become the heart of this stand against nature's fury, her strength reflected in the eyes of every soldier who passed through her doors. This diner, surrounded by endless snow and biting wind, was no longer just a refuge. It was a symbol of resistance, a beacon of humanity standing firm against the storm. Here, in this fragile bastion, the ties between strangers grew unbreakable, woven tightly with threads of kindness, courage, and shared purpose. The storm had finally begun to relent, its howling fury softened into a gentle whisper against the snow-laden trees. Inside the transformed diner, a calm reverence settled over the soldiers and civilians alike, a quiet pause before the next chapter of their shared story. Grace Turner stood just outside the door, the cold air crisp against her cheeks, her heart pounding with a mix of nervous anticipation and deep humility. Today was more than just another day of survival. It was a day of recognition, a moment where the invisible threads of sacrifice and kindness would finally be acknowledged. The convoy's temporary headquarters had been established in a large heated tent not far from the diner. Inside, officers and enlisted personnel gathered with an unspoken understanding that something extraordinary was about to unfold. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Jensen stood at the forefront, his posture firm but his eyes soft with genuine respect. Grace's footsteps were steady yet tentative as she crossed the threshold, every step carrying the weight of unspoken memories, of Tom's laughter echoing in these very spaces, of countless mornings brewing coffee and warming hearts amid the cold Montana wilds. The colonel's voice cut through the hushed room, clear and resolute. Today, we honor not only a citizen but a hero. In the face of a merciless storm, Grace Turner opened her doors without hesitation, feeding and sheltering soldiers in need. No questions asked, no payment expected. Her selflessness saved lives and lifted spirits when hope seemed most distant. She embodies the very spirit of this nation. A ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, a shared acknowledgement of the quiet heroism that had anchored them all. Grace felt her breath hitch as a young captain approached, holding a small velvet-lined box, the symbol of official gratitude, an army commendation medal gleaming softly in the tense light. Her hands trembled ever so slightly as the box was opened, revealing the medal's ribbon, vibrant against the soft fabric. On behalf of the United States Army, the captain intoned, "We present Miss Grace Turner with this medal and our deepest gratitude." The applause that followed was both thunderous and intimate, an outpouring of respect that filled the tent with warmth. Sergeant Danny Brooks rose from his seat, his voice steady but thick with emotion. "Thank you, ma'am, for everything. You didn't just save our bodies, you saved our spirits." Grace's eyes shimmered with unshed tears as she accepted the medal, her voice calm yet resolute. "I did what anyone would do. This diner, this community, it's built on respect and service. Today, you reminded me why we keep going." The ceremony shifted as Lieutenant Colonel Jensen gestured toward a long table laden with supplies, barrels of oil, sacks of flour, fresh produce, and a brand new generator, gifts that promised the diner's survival long after the snow melted. The relief and gratitude that swept through Grace were overwhelming, yet she found strength in the Colonel's simple words. "Keep giving. The world needs more people like you." Outside, the sun broke through the lingering clouds, casting golden rays across the snow-draped pines. Grace Turner stepped forward, metal pinned to her sweater, inhaling the crisp air. The diner behind her no longer felt just like a building. It was a testament of kindness, resilience, and an unyielding spirit that no storm could extinguish. As the first light of dawn stretched slowly over the snow-blanketed Montana landscape, a fragile sense of peace settled over the world outside Grace Turner's diner. The storm, relentless and unforgiving just hours before, had softened into a gentle whisper, as if nature itself were holding its breath to witness the quiet miracle unfolding within this small haven. Grace stood at the threshold, her gaze tracing the soft glow illuminating the pine trees, the crisp air filling her lungs with a clarity that felt both new and ancient. The weight of the night's trials still pressed upon her, yet beneath it all was a simmering ember of hope, a hope born not just from survival, but from a profound connection that had been forged in the crucible of hardship. Inside, the diner hummed with subdued energy. Soldiers stirred beneath layers of quilts, their breath still visible in the cold morning air, yet their eyes held the promise of renewal. The clinking of pots and soft murmur of quiet conversations mingled with the comforting aroma of fresh coffee brewing on the old stove. Grace moved through the space with reverence and tenderness, careful not to disturb the fragile moments of rest that had been so hard-won. Each gesture, from topping off a coffee cup to smoothing a blanket over a sleeping soldier, was infused with the silent language of care and resilience. Her thoughts drifted to Tom, the man who had built this diner, who had returned from distant battlefields only to face a different kind of war at home. His legacy was etched in every worn wooden beam, every scar on the countertop, every flicker of the hearth's fire. Grace carried his memory like a sacred flame, a steady light guiding her through the darkest hours. In this dawn, she felt his presence more keenly than ever, as if the very air around her whispered his enduring spirit. The metal pin to her sweater caught the morning sun, a tangible symbol of a gratitude that transcended words. Yet Grace knew this recognition was not an end but a beginning, a call to keep the doors open, to keep the warmth alive, to be a beacon for those who would find themselves lost in the cold. This diner was more than bricks and mortar. It was a living testament to the power of kindness, the strength of community, and the quiet courage that often goes unseen. Outside, life was stirring anew. The convoy's vehicles, dusted with the fresh snow, stood ready to move once the roads cleared. Soldiers prepared to depart, but the bonds forged here would not fade with the storm. There was a collective understanding that they carried a piece of this place and of Grace's unwavering spirit with them as they returned to their distant posts. Grace took a deep breath, the cool air filling her with a serene resolve. The future was uncertain. There would be more storms, more hardships, but the legacy she nurtured would endure. In every meal served, every hand held, every door opened in the face of adversity, the light of this dawn would live on. And as the sun rose higher, casting long golden rays across the snowy expanse, Grace Turner stood quietly at her diner's doorway, ready to meet whatever came next, with a heart full of courage, a soul anchored in love, and a legacy that would never fade.